Hello and welcome to Dialogue. As signs of climate change become more difficult to ignore, the 2021 Climate Adaptation Summit was held in the Netherlands this week. Global leaders discussed ways to adapt, urging international organizations and banks to increase funding for those on climate resilience. And what new ideas came out of the summit? How serious are the issues the world already faces, and what is being done, and how much worse could it get? To talk about these questions and more, I'm joined by Isabel Hilton, CEO of China Dialogue, and later by Dr. Shen Yiyang, Director of the Inclusive Development Research Center and Senior Consultant for the Asian Development Bank, and Wu Changhua, Executive Director of the Professional Association for China's Environment. That is our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. So let me start with you, Isabel. The 2021 Climate Adaptation Summit went ahead this week despite the ongoing pandemic. But we notice the theme is adaptation. What is your take on adaptation? Does it mean that we have to live with climate change?
This has been a bit of a debate in the climate community because people did argue that if we embraced adaptation, it would diminish our resolve to mitigate, to stop climate change. I think now we've come to a recognition that a certain amount of climate change is built in, that we need to accelerate our mitigation efforts, but that there are vulnerable communities that are already suffering, and that adaptation is absolutely going to be necessary, not just in vulnerable communities, but lots of our cities are going to be affected. We've seen the impacts of climate change already this year. So adaptation and mitigation are now pretty much on an equal standing.
When you are saying those vulnerable groups and cities, what exactly are you referring to?
Well, I'm looking at, for example, in China's case, you have a lot of delta cities, very important developments. You know, you look at the Pearl River Delta or Shanghai, a little sea level rise, and you have problems. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that the city is going to be flooded, but a storm surge, such as we saw, for example, in New York with Storm Sandy, can cause absolute devastation. So we have to look at all the kind of vulnerable parts of our own infrastructure, which is often built to, standards and needs of 100 years ago, not to what's going to happen in the next 50 years. And that can be very different. So we look across our societies, how things work, what could be vulnerable, what's going to be resilient. And that's what adaptation is about. It's recognizing that climate change has impacts and anticipating those impacts across the world and dealing with them.
Will this kind of strain be felt the same in developed and developing worlds?
Well, it potentially, of course, yes. However, there's a very different capacity to deal with it. In the developing world, there's a shortage of capital. And there are very vulnerable populations. They tend to be more dependent, for example, on agriculture, which is likely to change with changing climate conditions, and have less capacity in some ways to adapt. On the other hand, they also have an opportunity, since they're still developing, to develop in the right way. And it's very important, I think, that finance is directed to resilient development, to development that anticipates climate change. And that could be a plus for them, whereas the already built societies are going to have to adapt what they've already done.
And we have listened in to Chilean President Sebastián Piñera. He said the adaptation is not an option, it is an urgent task for this generation and those to come. Does this burden fall on the government of this generation or the businesses, and who should pay for the adaptation efforts?
Well, I think we should all pay, but I think we need to regard it as investment. You know, if we don't do this, we stand to lose far more. So yes, there is an upfront cost, and that needs to be absorbed by governments, but also by businesses, by banks, by finance ought to be looking at, resilient investment. There is no point in investing in 19th century technology at this point. It's going to be a stranded asset. And China, in many ways, has led the way on this. China has been thinking about green bonds, green finance. It's been thinking about, the positive aspects of the transition and how that can be a driver of an economy. So we shouldn't always think of this just as a burden. It's also an opportunity.
And another question is, can adaptation and mitigation catch up with the emission increase? Because obviously the pandemic reduced global greenhouse gas emissions roughly by 7% in 2020. But the problem is that was only a temporary drop. And the worrying thing is that probably it will all come back up with greater force when economic recovery is on. What is your estimate of the emission reduction efforts?
Well, that it's certainly a risk that after this pause, which has been delivered after all by a terrible global shock, that the impetus will be to go back to the old ways of doing things just to get economies going again. And of course that's a temptation because people are unemployed. We need to get some life back in the economy. But to return to the old ways of doing things, which after all are the ways that have created this problem, would be a huge missed opportunity. Many countries have now got pandemic recovery plans, economic recovery plans. The analysis of those is that they are partly green, but not really green enough. So in the European Union, for example, you have the Green New Deal. China has elements of green in its recovery plan. But the critical thing at this moment is really to avoid the temptation to go back to business as usual. And this is, again, I would say this is an opportunity. We really need to get serious because although we have been making some progress on mitigation, we still have quite a long way to go and time is very much running out. We can't adapt beyond a certain level of climate change. We might be able to adapt to 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris target.
Yeah.
We can't adapt to a 3-degree world. It's too much.
But Isabel, the reality is a lot of the major economies still rely on those carbon-based fuels. And as you said, it won't change overnight. Are you satisfied with the methods, approaches that we have seen so far?
Well, again, I think it's accelerating. I think it needs to accelerate. One of the encouraging things about the end of last year was the number of countries that set net zero or carbon zero pledges with a date attached, including China.
Yeah.
2060 carbon zero pledge. That was followed by Japan, South Korea, the European Union has one. The change of administration in the US is hugely important in that regard. So we now have these commitments which are in theory Paris compliant. I say in theory because the pathways to meet those commitments are still being worked out. But we have measurable commitments and we know that the sooner we start, the less steep the mountain is going to be. If we leave it later, we just have a steeper mountain to climb. And that's as true of China as anywhere else. So I think that we're finally seeing, we're seeing climate change enter to the major considerations of finance ministries, of investors, of banks. People are beginning to understand that there is no way around this. And, that has a positive side again. Renewables have got cheaper, largely because China has made them cheaper. So, there are, as I say, real opportunities here, but we really need to focus on this.
Yes, and the encouraging thing is that we see that the energy produced by new energy has surpassed that of fossil fuel in Europe. Do you foresee that will also happen in Asia and America anytime soon?
Well, it could, again, that depends on the effort. We know what to do. We know how to do it. We have the technology to do it. So much of this it's about political will, and it's about working out how to deal with those legacy ways of doing things and legacy industries which will suffer. There are relatively few economic areas now that couldn't, for example, be electrified. There are a few bits of heavy industry, but we'll figure that out. There's been an enormous increase in renewables, even in the United States under President Trump, who was possibly the least helpful individual on the planet. as far as climate change goes, a lot of states and cities went ahead with their commitments to Paris goals. So there is a kind of underlying mood in the United States, and now very, very explicit commitments by President Biden to catch up. That will involve tripling the US renewable capacity in a pretty short time. He set some very, very ambitious goals. But that will really inject some energy and vitality into the global process now that the US is back on board. So, you can be optimistic. We have to keep at it, though.
Let's also look at the difficulties. As you said, former President Trump may be not a big fan of green energy, but he's just the front of those interest groups, those, as you said, the fossil fuel energy industries and those interest groups that are associated with it. How can we convince them to turn away their profitable business into something else?
Yep. Well, you're absolutely right. There are very powerful interest groups. However, if you look at the return on investment over the past 10 years, renewables have been just a much better investment. Coal companies are going bankrupt in the United States. Trump had a huge effort to try to save the US coal industry. It didn't stop coal companies going bankrupt because, it doesn't make economic sense anymore. Renewables are cheaper than building new fossil energy everywhere. And so why not invest in the future rather than in the past? And for energy companies or for fossil fuel companies, even the big oil majors are beginning to see the writing on the wall. And they're beginning to describe themselves as energy companies rather than oil companies because they can see that, for example, the United Kingdom has set a date for eliminating petrol-driven motor transport, and many other countries are doing the same. Once transport goes electric, what's an oil company for? They have to start adapting, and they have to start thinking of their own future, or they're just going to go bankrupt. They're just going to be dinosaurs. Now, it is a big challenge, and they will resist as hard as they can, and we saw that in the last US administration. But there's been a big shift. It's not the same world as it was when Donald Trump came to power. The United States gets 38% of its energy from non-fossil sources already. Quite a lot of that is in nuclear plants, and they will have to be renewed. However, the targets are there, the technology is there, and the investment is there. So they ought to, and the will is there. So for the time being, I expect we'll see pretty rapid progress.
And talking back to the theme of this adaptation summit, we have seen a pledge from 1,000 cities across the world to try to adopt measures to adapt to the climate change. What are those measures exactly, and are they working?
Well, it's early days, and some of them are very challenging. The small island states, for example, they're not very far above sea level, and it doesn't take much to render them uninhabitable. And there are countries such as Bangladesh, which is very, very low-lying, where you really do have a problem. But now that the world is turning its attention to it, and in particular, I think now that people understand that finance has to move in this direction pretty rapidly, and that was another thing that the Trump administration did, was that it defaulted on the pledges to help finance, to help support adaptation. I think we'll see movement. It is going to be a big challenge, and there will be places where adaptation just isn't possible. Wow. And we will see big movements of population, I'm afraid. So one of the difficulties of adaptation is knowing exactly what you're adapting to. Yeah. And because we're in a dynamic situation.
It is a changing world.
That's sometimes hard to know. Yeah,
exactly. So if this is the case, it is still very fluid. That means every country has its own tailored policies. Is it really some principles underlying different countries' responses?
Well, I think that engineering standards have characteristically, in a stable world, been set to the experience of the previous 100 years. That is over. the next 50 years are going to be nothing like the previous 100 years. And I think that's going to require quite a considerable shift in thinking to anticipate rather than to draw on past experience. There are aspects of this in which past experience just isn't helpful. It's not radical enough. So we have to become very progressive in our thinking, and that means that we all really have to adjust.
Do you have a gold standard country in terms of response and adaptation efforts in different continents?
One country you might look at is of course the Netherlands, which is hosting the Adaptation Summit. The Netherlands is below sea level, and for hundreds of years the Netherlands has had to deal with the threat of flooding and you know the facts of its geography. The Netherlands has a lot of experience which could be applied to similar situations around the world, and there's quite a lot of innovative thinking about, you know, how you deal with it, not just in terms of traditional engineering, but how you float a city, for example. Quite radical stuff, and I think we'll see, you know, a lot of that sort of thinking. There's also just some basic questions like how does agriculture adapt to different tolerances and different conditions, different pests, different diseases, different opportunities. So I think in every sector there's going to have to be some fresh thinking.
Well, it is a test of inventiveness and ingenuity. Thank you very much, Isabel. And let's turn to our another guest, Mr. Shen Yang from the Asian Development Bank, talking about adaptations. One group is pretty vulnerable, that's farmers. The summit also focused on investment to help farmers, although small farmers adapt to the pressures on their food productions. So, Mr. Shen, where are the farmers being the hardest hit, and what are the helps that can be offered to them?
Well, I think the farmers are very vulnerable, you know, for the climate change, especially for adaptation to the negative climate change impact. So I think now we need a lot of public financing to support them, and also innovative technology like you know, solar irrigation system. Those kind of system can be, you know, self-sustained, I mean financially, and those technology are good, you know, for those farmers. For the other, you know, farming technologies, I think there are a lot of technologies there. We just need to find a proper business model to make sure, you know, both public financing and, you know, private financing can all support them.
Obviously, financing is key here, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also urged donor countries and banks to increase their financing for climate change adaptations. But we understand the world is still busy coping with COVID and recovering their economies one way or another. Do you think governments and banking institutions can have the wherewithal to invest in those adaptation efforts?
I think comparing with mitigation, you know, business models, adaptation actually, you know, lacking, you know, a very good business model. So far, bilateral or, you know, multilateral international banks and the governments are the major source of financing for adaptation. However, you know, as you mentioned, after COVID-19, especially the public financing from all donor countries now, you know, in a critical situation. So I think, especially in the coming 2 years, you know, we do need, you know, of course, those donor countries can continue to support. On the other hand, we have to, you know, mobilize the resource of private financing and create innovative, you know, business models to make sure all those adaptation technologies can work.
And now we have another guest, Ms. Wu Changhua, on the line, Executive Director of the Professional Association for China Environment. So, Ms. Wu, in the U.S., the Biden administration has rejoined the Paris Agreement, issued an executive order to revoke the Keystone oil pipeline, and promised to do a lot of stuff. But this is a different America, and it's a different world. Will this break with Trump policies on energy change the global climate picture?
It's very exciting to see the U.S. coming back to the Paris Agreement to be part of a member of the international community to fight climate change collectively. Of course, as a new president in the White House, and the first thing first, so President Biden has started a process of reversing many of the environmental regulations damaged by President Trump, and I think collectively there are more than 100 of them. And so through presidential executive order, that's a policy window, so that's what's happening now. The signals sending from such an endeavor is significant. One, of course, U.S. back to the international community and fighting climate change. Domestically, I think all the measures are concentrated around reducing fossil fuels and shrinking the space for fossil fuel development. In the meantime, to protect the nature and the land, for the Native Americans' heritage land, and the waterways as well. And so in a nutshell, I think the U.S. policy, the new administration is coming together. We can literally start to see the trends and the directions.
Okay. But what are the specific policies? Because White House National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy said more policies, detailed policies, will be announced this week. Can you speculate what exactly will that include, Ms. Wu?
Yeah, and I think this could be examined from a couple of perspectives. One is emission reductions. And so one thing the Biden administration is moving forward is to revise or recover the emission standards of vehicles. And because back in the Obama administration, he set a very ambitious target, but somehow got reversed by the Trump administration. And second perspective is really the fossil fuels, right? And so the policies, including the Keystone pipeline project and others, literally, phase out fossil fuel energy as much as possible. The third element is really around nature-based solutions. There, of course, on one side, there is a kind of conservation of the cultural heritage, historic heritage, but more importantly, nature has a big role to play in terms of carbon sink, as well as providing more positive productivity for nature. Of course, I think what's looking forward now is this $2 trillion sort of package and around the infrastructure. And in that context, actually, we know for sure clean energy will be a big part of it, plus resilience, adaptation, particularly for the minority or poverty regions or communities in the U.S. So those are the policies moving forward. And as I said, the politics remains uncertain in the U.S., but overall, the policy direction.
I want to pin you down on the politics,
clear.
Because during the Obama administration, his favorite project, the solar panel project, has run into problems. Somebody say debacle. So this time, GOP probably will represent those fossil fuel industries and push back against Biden's policy.
It's very possible, but if you look at the congressional situation, so there is a small margin of Democrats and 10 seats in the House and 50-50 in the Senate. So this is a very tricky political situation. So it's a minority, a small, slim, actually, razor thin sort of a majority by the Democrats. And so the politics will be unfolding at the Congress. One thing actually, so yes, now President Biden signed executive order to rejoin the Paris Agreement, but we are not sure, 4 years later, whether that's going to continue or not. Then domestically, there's a whole package, particularly around the infrastructure, green infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure, the money. I think this politics will be played out around the budgetary, the numbers there. We don't know yet, and it's tricky. So from the executive side, of course, Biden is championing moving forward to deploy or deliver his commitment, presidential running sort of in the race, and he made a huge commitment around the clean energy revolution, around the climate adaptation. But then on the other side, we don't know yet for sure at this moment. He does have a lot of work to do in order to really make through his agenda.
Mr. Shen, talking about commitment, Biden is also committed to international cooperation, probably especially with China. But we still don't know in what shape and form China and the U.S. can work together to promote green energy, green infrastructure, and green development. What is your take?
Well, I think climate change is a global issue. Definitely, China and the U.S. should work together. I think both countries can, contribute more, to those vehicles like Green Climate Fund, and through World Bank, Asia Development Bank, or AIIB. I think through these, vehicles, we can, the countries can work together, to deal with those adaptation issues. What is more, the so-called, triangular cooperation, which means, a developed country like U.S. or European countries, Japan, can work with, these emerging developing country like China, India, and then work with another southern country like African countries. Those, north, south, this kind of, cooperation maybe can create, more, better models to deal with the task, the issue.
We've also collected opinions from some social media users talking about climate change and our response to the changing environment. Sunia Kumar Yadav said the EU, US, and China are on a united front when it comes to climate change. By accelerating the clean energy transition, we also benefit from cleaner air, water, better jobs, secure and resilient communities, and stronger economies along in the future. Well, that is very optimistic, but Ms. Wu, talking about international cooperation, we understand that along the way there are many obstacles. Who should do what and who should do more. You foresee that kind of back and forth still coming down the road?
Well, this year, so at the end of this year, COP26 of the Climate Convention of UN will be held in Glasgow, UK. Yeah. I think, yes, the politics, ups and downs, trading off will be displayed in that process. But generally, I think the tone is very different this year compared to previous international process. This is a sort of a pivotal year, right? And this is about recovery. And this is about how we reshape a future infrastructure, deploying new technologies, and really enhance sustainability. So on one side is a security issue. We have to make sure we are vulnerable, and we have to enhance the resilience capability to deal with those challenges, climate change challenges there. But in the meantime, we literally have to jointly create a different economic model, right? And this is where I think the consensus is coming in.
Can you give me an example to flesh out international cooperation to help China? Because China pledged to become carbon neutral by 2060. That is no easy job. What kind of international cooperation can make that happen easier and quicker?
Well, I think first of all, it's a China commitment. So China has to deliver it, right? Different countries have committed to this carbon neutrality around the mid of century. So first thing first, it's a national commitment, and so that China has to figure out how to deliver that domestically, which is very challenging. It's not an easy task at all for such the second largest economy, developing economy in the world. From the international perspective, collaboration and partnership will be crucial. In terms of, we still need more technologies. And so emerging technologies around hydrogen and others, we need to work together, make sure to reduce the cost of emerging technologies as much as possible.
Okay.
That's where the international partnership comes in.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wu. Thank you, Mr. Shen. And thank you for your insights. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhou in Beijing. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.